Greetings, mortals. I come before you by the grace of His Divine Majesty to impart the tale of my brief existence and the trials endured by my lovely daughter, Ardelisa, whose virtue and faith has carried her and my charge, the Count of Longueville, to rewards on your plane of existence, which will be multiplied in the next. More importantly, I hope that my story tempers your resolve to trust in the power of Providence, and that a life of virtuous actions, commitment to faith, humility, and justice will not only reward you in this life, but assure your admittance into paradise. My tale begins in the year 1702 in France. Due to continued taxation and neglect from my sovereign, I took it upon myself to change my circumstances by selling parts of my estate to fund my desire to settle in Constantinople and to establish a trade business. Despite my protests of having my daughter and my charge, the Count of Longueville, take part in my wanderlust, I was convinced to reconsider after their assertions of their safety, loyalty, and love. After we all departed from my servants on the barge aptly named the Bonaventure, translated to Good Adventures, we made to Constantinople and arrived at the French consul. In this land of the heretics, these worshippers of Muhammad, my boding soul seemed to forewarn me of misfortune, even more so due to the animalistic lust of the Turks who would prey upon my daughter. Most notably, the captain of the port's son, Mahomet, whose passionate inclinations towards my daughter were made evident by his questioning of my servants and his letters to her. By my approval, I consented to my daughter's marriage to the Count de Longueville, whom I viewed as my own son, and whose gentlemanlike nature earned her hand and by her admission her heart. I ordered the young count to secretly depart with half of our goods and to deprive the barbarians of any fortune, and for my daughter to seek refuge with the consul in secret, having anticipated that the infidels would attack us that night. I knew there would be no arguing with what the fates have decreed, so I performed my duty as a father to protect my two loved ones. As expected, the Mahomet attacked the house that evening, his barbarism exhibited through his demand that I consent to him violating my daughter before me and taking all of our goods as mercy for our lives. I refused his offer with disdain and rage, making it clear that she shall choose death over dishonor and that the God I serve will preserve her virtue and revenge my death. As he demanded his slaves to search the house for my daughter, I smiled as I accepted my fate and, raising my hands to heaven, appealed to my Lord in these words: "'Tis just, my God, that I, who have exposed my child, should first feel the misery my rashness merits. But do not let her perish here. Preserve her, great Creator, from the lust and rage of these vile infidels, and let thy angels guide her home again. Let my blood expiate all my sins and give me courage in this great extremity." The slaves returned that moment, unable to find my beloved Ardelisa, and the infidel Mahomet, in his rage, stabbed me in the heart. With a final breath, I appealed to my God, once more saying, "Mercy, my Savior," before finally dying. The fiends slaughtered my remaining servants, and it is to them that I impart my sorrow. By the miracle of the divine, I was allowed to visit my daughter as she dreamed. Though unable to speak, I imparted my condition to her as a warning as well as a vision of what was to come: a group of strangers, a desolate place, and hunger. These were trials she would have to endure and face in order to achieve deliverance. My daughter received this message clearly as she departed the consul's home with her servants disguised as men, to their country estate, where they remained for some days. It was during this time that one of her servants, Joseph, happened to discover a small cottage that held within all indications of a Christian dweller, such as books, of devotion in the Latin tongue and a crucifix. It was on his return to my daughter that he happened to encounter a Turk who had planned to tell their master of Ardalisa's location, and after dispatching of the traitorous Turk, managed to enable their escape to this cottage, which was a home to a Santuin, a converted Turk, by the name of Father Francis. The good father received them and sheltered them as the venomous Mahomet rampaged through the village of Domes Dure, threatening to kill innocent civilians until he found her. News reached my daughter and her servants of the Count Longueville's escape from danger and that he is returned to France from letters that informed him of my death and my daughter's safety. Despite my daughter's sorrows at her misfortune, the good father counseled her to trust in Providence and rest satisfied as his design will assure her happiness thereafter. It would be 3 months before opportunity presented itself for Ardalisa and her servants to return to Domes Dure, the heathen Mahomet having been moved to the army and out of the village. Unfortunately, during their travel, they encountered another ravenous Turk by the name of Aubin, who became enchanted by Ardalisa's face and resolved to keep her for himself either as a man or woman, since she was disguised as the former. After taking the company to the general's home, the Turk was summoned to appear before the emperor, the divine's work once again leaving my daughter unsullied. By Providence, the Turkish dog met a cruel fate, as the gift he brought for his sultan was received with displeasure, and the general was imprisoned to a tower. The news traveled to the general's home, whose slaves waited news as to whom they would be sold off to next, thereby taking no care to secure their captives. My daughter met with another Christian captive by the name of Violetta, who bore Osman a child and baptized him in secret. After some introductions, the women resolved on escaping their captor's house under the cover of night. As this was taking place, the good Father Francis encountered a dying hermit who lived beneath the earth and attended to him, giving him his last rites and listening to his tale. The man was known once as Don Fernando de Cardiole, a noble Spaniard who, after avenging himself against an unfaithful woman and living a life of debauchery among the Turks, felt remorse for his actions and lived the remainder of his days in seclusion and repentance. Father Francis was left with the remaining fortune of Don Fernando on his deathbed by his consent, and after taking the cabinet, traveled to the consul's house in Constantinople, where he was received favorably, appealing God to preserve Ardalisa and her servants while giving thanks for the goodness he received. It was later that night that my daughter and her company arrived at the consul's house, having escaped the general's imprisonment by setting his house on fire. The entire company left for France a few days later with provisions provided by the consul. A new trial would present itself, as a storm had hit the ships, with only my daughter and her people, including the captain, the sole survivors of the shipwreck. For 2 months they endured their hardships on an island, their faith reassured by the good father before they were rescued by none other than Violetta's father, who had lost his daughter during a war with the Turks. Thus they were rescued and their faith was rewarded. It was during this time that love and fortune blossomed for everyone, as Violetta and the captain received news of Osman's demise in prison, and the captain had inherited his uncle's fortune and the title of Marquis of Roquemont. My daughter's faith in her husband proved to be true, as he retired to a Franciscan convent to await news from his messengers who were dispatched to Turkey about her well-being. Upon arriving on her native soil of France, my daughter employed the good father to act the final proof on her husband to reaffirm his fidelity to her by giving him news of her death and judge his reaction. This deception was carried out, and the Count of Longueville reacted as a true husband, committing himself to the service of the church before fainting at the news of his beloved's demise. The good father, having been sufficiently satisfied with this reaction per my daughter's design, restored my son-in-law to his senses, revealing all before reuniting them at last. Thus, their tale concludes as not one family, but 2 others are created as the servants Joseph and Nanetta, along with the captain and Violetta, joined my daughter Ardalisa and the Count of Longueville as blessed families by his grace and benevolence. The wisdom that I wish to impart unto you mortals is the power of divine providence, and how living a life of goodness, virtue, and faith, as opposed to yielding to avarice, wickedness, and blasphemy, will yield rewards that will not only comfort the body, but also the soul. Despite my own misfortune at the hands of an infidel, Providence had acted in securing the virtue and fortune of my daughter, as well as delivering my vengeance to the barbarians who attempted to violate her. The fiend Mahomet, though elevated to the throne, was the pride of his prize, whereas my daughter, through her commitment to maintaining her virtue, her faith, and helping people in need, is not only delivered from her plights, but was rewarded with a happy marriage, fortune, and a place in paradise. As a father, you do what you must to secure your family. Therefore, my death is not to be seen as an act that succumbs faith to condemnation, for it had the intended effect of spreading rumor through the city of my daughter's demise that same night, thus securing her from the infidel. My virtuous action granted an audience with her as she dreamed, forewarning her of what was to come, and due to her upbringing, she was able to elude her pursuer by her wits, and on no small account of what Providence had provided. Sanctuary at Domus Dure and the house of the good Father Francis, who lay deep within the woods. The powers of divine justice had acted through the servant Joseph, as he dispatched of the traitorous Turk who wished to disclose the whereabouts of my daughter to his lascivious master, the fiend acknowledging the power of the Christian God as he lay dying. The Father Francis was also preserved by Providence, as he endured the loss of his brother and slavery, sustaining himself through being a beggar and wanderer, which had enabled the priest to come across my daughter and Don Fernando de Cardiole, to whom he provided final services, and for his absolution conferred upon the father his remaining fortune. Even more, the fate of the heathen Osman, after taking my daughter, lays credence to my lord's justice, as he was imprisoned by his heretical brothers and his house set ablaze in holy fire, providing the means of escape for my daughter and her company into the safety of the consul. Though their journey across the sea was hindered by a storm, the company survived the storm as the other sailors perished into the sea, weighed down by their greed after overloading their ships with goods, which is no different from the heathen Turks that tried to take my daughter, their barbarism and corruption rewarded with loss of their honor and lives. Much like my lord's son, who endured 40 days and nights of starvation, my daughter and her company endured their trials for the betterment of their souls and to appreciate their moments in your world, this mortal world. Their piety rewarded with provisions from the sea, supplied from ships whose destruction at sea from battle has given new life to the patient and humble. Their endurance and faith in the Almighty's plan yielded reward, as they were found by none other than Violetta's father, who delivered them to safety, and they, learning from their trials, left provisions on the island for any other individuals who would happen to be stranded on that same island. Showing love for those who would come across similar misfortune. More proof of the divine's hand at work is evidenced by the death of Osman, whose body was dragged through the streets, providing a fine example of the consequences of lasciviousness and violent behavior. His loss allowed for Violetta, who suffered but never wavered from her faith, to follow her heart and marry the good captain, as well as my daughter securing passage back home from her earlier assistance in their escape due to Violetta's father providing transport. My daughter was reunited with her faithful husband, and all families, through their many afflictions and misfortunes, were rewarded for their faith, virtue, and goodness towards one another, making them all happy and fortunate. It is with these words that I implore each of you to consider your actions and not stray from the path of righteousness, for traveling down the path of wickedness will in the end bring you to eternal ruin. So I conclude this tale and return to the realm of the divine with the hope that I have imparted wisdom unto all of you. May you all be blessed in your mortal lives, and may divine providence preserve you all. Thank you. Cheers. Let's go. go. Farewell.